Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Stephanie Hare. She is a researcher, broadcaster, and author focused on technology, politics, and history. And today we're going to talk about her book, Technology is Not Neutral, a short guide to technology ethics. So, Dr. Hare, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much for having me, or obrigada.
Great. So, technology ethics. I guess that people who think about this, who look at this, would think that, okay, it's just another philosophy thing. Why should we care about that? It's just about some abstract questions. But I mean, what is it really about, and what kinds of more practical questions, let's say, does it deal with?
I love your idea of like, one more philosophy, as if we're being bombarded by philosophies all the time, and there's just philosophers walking around selling their wares in the street,
Yeah.
which I guess is maybe true. We would just call them marketing people now. Uh, Gosh, no. So look, I think technology and the way that humans have a relationship with technology has existed probably since we, developed opposable thumbs and started making tools. So we would have picked up bones or stones or twigs and started fashioning them, creating fire. And probably from that moment, you started having human beings disagreeing about, when is it acceptable to make a fire? What are the rules around fire? Is fire for cooking and keeping us warm and keeping predators away? Or is it okay to like torch our enemy camp's village? Or use it, launch it into an arrow and shoot it at people. So I just
Yeah.
feel like in some ways it's like nothing new under the sun, as Shakespeare said. It's always been there. So I don't feel like this is like a new idea that people are hawking. I think it's one of the oldest things because it's so fundamental to us. Beings have been making technology, for a really long time, and we've also been philosophizing for a really long time. Because if we think about philosophy, kind of the way it's taught today, it's very abstract. We think about it in universities, philosophy departments, writing about topics that most of us probably are never going to read a book about, or an article, or really care, which is a shame because we're actually doing philosophy all the time. We're doing it every day. So if you're interested in power and in politics, that welcome to philosophy. You're doing political philosophy. If you're interested in like good and bad, right and wrong, where do we draw the line on certain things? Welcome to philosophy. You're doing ethics. If you have really strong views on aesthetics, which could be anything from design in your house to like the sustainability or labor relations that go into the materials that you buy, any product that you buy or service that you buy, or even things like user design and user experience. Welcome to philosophy. You are doing aesthetics, right? And so on and so forth. So we're doing it all the time, but I think we weren't, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon world, we're not really taught it in the way that often you are in the continent, much more explicitly. So I think that was like the first bridge I wanted to build with people that I work with, both in my client work, but also in my writing, was to kind of get everybody confident with the fact that actually you've already been doing this your whole life. So now that we give you the terms, you have like a name for what you're doing, and I can take you through examples of how you've been doing it. That's a bit empowering and confidence building. So now you can start doing it deliberately, because that is a shift. I think there's something really cool about how philosophy exists as a tool set.
Yeah.
It's very practical, it's very pragmatic. So if you're facing, I don't know, a problem or an opportunity, you're trying to evaluate to do something or not to do something, or just what you think about something, like what's your point of view on it. Sometimes, particularly today, life is very complicated. It can be nice to have a tool set that helps you to think through things so that you can do it with a bit of rigor, and then you can talk about it. It gives you like a shared menu, if you will, a shared script for talking about it with other people. And it's really nice if you're a problem solver by profession, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a technologist or an engineer. You might be a problem solver as a lawyer, as a regulator. you might be, or even as like a CEO, and you're having to figure out, do we go this way or that way? What problem am I trying to solve here? It can
Yeah.
be really nice because it's like a due diligence exercise. It allows you, you can go through it, and when you're done, you're like, okay, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And that's really helpful. So I think that's the thing that I find really exciting about technology ethics is it's really practical. Like when I go in and teach this to people afterwards, they're like, we're doing the way our team functions is different now, or the way that we tackle opportunity and risk assessment is different now. And by different, I'm hoping they mean better, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to necessarily be, and right now AI ethics is very buzzy and has been for a couple of years, but like I don't limit my analysis to AI. I go as broad as you can in terms of all technology because AI is just, it's an exciting technology and it's definitely the technology of the day in terms of the media and marketing cycle. But there's so much more, there's so much more we can do with philosophy in terms of the human tech relationship. So I think it's really fun. I wouldn't have spent my time on it if I found it boring or not useful. On the contrary, once I started really working with this, I was like, this is powerful and it's helpful. And that is great because if you are trying to tackle particularly complicated problems, you need every tool that you have.
And I mean, the main question you tackle in the book is technology neutral? And of course, just by looking at the title, your position is obvious. But even before we get into your position and go through some examples that really are illustrative of the fact that technology might not be neutral, give us perhaps some examples of arguments from the other side, people who argue that technology is indeed neutral, that you find perhaps the most compelling.
Yeah, so I actually used to think technology was neutral. It was in the writing of the book that I had to change my mind. And I'll give a few examples of why I used to think this. First of all, I came from a business perspective
Yeah.
where, and I should declare my nationality interest. So I'm American by birth, and then I've had my career in the United Kingdom. So this is very much an Anglo-Saxon free markets, capitalism, hardcore perspective, because I appreciate that's not the case everywhere for your global audience of this interview. That perspective is very anti-regulation. Regulation is always being portrayed as like hindering innovation. It's going to stop innovation. And innovation is really key, particularly in the US, to American superpower competitiveness. So anything that would hinder that instantly becomes political. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Everybody's like, nobody wants to.
Everything that hinders that is the bloody communists.
Yeah, well, exactly. Like, take your pick. Are we scared of like the former Soviet Union? In the 80s,
Yeah.
it was Japan. Now it's China, right? So like,
Yeah.
nobody wants to hinder innovation with pesky regulation. So you have that right there shows you like it's not at the end of the innovation cycle, if you will. You decide, you build something, and you decide if you're going to regulate it or not. That is inherently not neutral. But the way it was being portrayed to argue against regulation, you would be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Classic example in the United States is guns don't kill people, people kill people. And that argument has been, if you will, weaponized very successfully in the United States to stop us from doing any real meaningful gun control. Not just because we have the Second Amendment, which gives Americans the right to bear arms, but when that law was crafted, we didn't have some of the weapons that we have today that you can buy at your local Walmart, often without an ID background check. It's actually quite staggering. And so the founding fathers were not imagining taking guns and walking into a school and shooting up an entire school, which unfortunately is a very common occurrence now, tragically all too common. And so I started looking at that being like, well, on the one hand, it is true. Guns do not on their own kill someone because they can't like self pull the trigger. They can't self shoot, if you will. Although people I'm sure are now working on building guns that do exactly that, AI powered weaponry. But even then, there's a human that's ultimately coding that and controlling it. So it's still, there's always a human that takes the gun and makes the decision to pull a trigger.
Right.
But I also was like, yeah, but the muskets that were there in the 18th century are really different from like an AK-15 assault rifle. You can kill a lot more people with the latter than with the
Sure.
former. So like a gun is not just a gun. Like even within like the gun analogy, the amount of harm I can do with a musket versus like a pistol versus like the kind of weaponry that frankly you should only ever be seeing held by the military in like a theater of war and is unfortunately on the street or in people's homes, is like inherently not neutral. There were design choices that went into the making of the gun, the way that the bullets are done. There's like cop killer bullets that can pierce body armor, right? So like the people who designed that knew that, and the people who are choosing to sell it know it. So like they're not neutral either, because you could decide to be like, we're not selling guns here. And there indeed was a sporting store in the US, I think it was Dick's Sporting Goods, which decided not to, and then it got this massive blowback and it became a national issue, precisely because they were exercising their right not to sell, right?
Yeah.
But that's not neutral, because now you're like removing my right, damn it, to have guns. So this isn't like I don't want to make a sort of pro or anti-gun statement. I have my own view on that, obviously, of course, as a citizen. I'm sure it's probably obvious from here. But what I mean is, even with something that's like such a little easy example, like guns, easy in comparison to AI, because it's like a physical, tool. Even that, you start to realize like it is not neutral to decide to design bullets that can pierce wound. Right? There's like no other reason that you would do that. There's no other purpose, particularly a good, benign purpose that you could use that for. So when you start thinking about it in that way, you can actually start looking at pretty much, I'm just looking around my house right now, like almost any object, you're like, shit, somebody has designed every aspect of it, from the raw materials that were pulled out of the ground to like the environmental impact of that, to how much the workers all got paid all along the supply chain. All of it, whether or not it's designed for the majority of the population, which is right-handed, or like, do we take left-handed people into account? What about if you're colorblind? What if you have like dyslexia? Like every single design consideration is not neutral. And that's just again, that's for like analog world physical objects. Now you take that to the next level and you start getting into code. It's the same principle, but it's also like turbocharged, because AI, one of the things that's like fascinating about what the world we're living in now is that because we have more data than ever before and computer processing power than ever before, we can do things faster and at a greater scale than at any time in human history. Whether or not that will hold, by the way, is very contentious. We don't know if we've reached the limits of computer processing power, for instance. We definitely haven't reached the limits of data. So that starts getting really messy. You also look at like who is doing the designing, be it for code or a physical object, and those groups are not representative of the whole of our populations, which is why it can sound like diversity and equality and inclusion. We call it DEI here. I'm not sure what it is in Portuguese, but you probably have a similar linguistic concept for it.
Yeah, the initials are pretty much the same.
Are they the same? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So DEI can, in many ways, just seem like another version of being politically correct, right? Or in the United States, it's like woke, and it's seen as like a bad thing. I don't look at it as a bad thing in terms of a political sense. I look at it from a design perspective of being like, if I'm selling something, bring out the capitalism. If I'm selling a service or a tool or a product, I want it to work for the vast majority, ideally for everybody. So I have a challenge there because I need it to scale, but I also need to be able to personalize and customize depending on your individual needs or the needs of your company or the needs of the country that you're based in, right? Because you might have different laws there. How do I focus on that? And that kind of stuff really fascinates me because I don't understand why it gets lampooned so much in certain branches of the press and indeed investment communities as being politicized. Because I'm like, that's just good business. But like that, that's just my That's just my
Yeah.
view, but I would assume as a good-hearted capitalist that you would want to design products that the majority of people can buy because that's ka-ching, more money. So it's very strange. So I guess that's what I mean when I say like technology ethics is so much bigger than just like is something good or bad. Like that's a really binary way of looking at it. It's very complex and rich. It's like a tapestry. You start pulling on one thread and then you pull on another and you come out with this whole complex analysis that you can use if you wish to make things better.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point there, you mentioned regulation and regulation across different countries, and perhaps later in the interview, when we talk about specific kinds of technologies, we can come back to this because recently with the release of Threads, it's interesting because here in the European Union, it's not available yet, and it has to do with data privacy, online privacy, data collection, data ownership, and all of that. So we can come back to this later. But I mean, at a certain point you mentioned there or alluded to one of the points you make in the book, because at a certain point you talk about or explore the idea of what is a tool and the difference, for example, between tools that are found and tools that are created. So tell us a little bit about that, because I think it's very helpful in terms of trying to reframe the way we think about these questions.
Yeah, so for me, this was, I wrote a lot of the book during the pandemic, during lockdowns. And I would, I'd go for my sort of hour-long walk, sometimes longer than an hour. Ooh, the British police will find out now that I was walking for an hour and a half. I would do these really long laps around my local park. And, that was such a weird time, right? It was such a strange time for all of us. And I started to really go into some fairly abstract directions of thinking. And so one of the things was like, let's think of the most neutral tool possible and then the most like non-neutral tool. So my examples, because I wanted to like draw the map, if you will, or draw a matrix, so what's like the most neutral and the most completely value-laden thing. So the hardcore one for me was the atomic bomb, which was there's only one reason that you would build an atomic bomb. And only one reason you're really going to use it, which is to harm, because there's no way of getting around that harm. It will, the radiation damage to any human that comes within the blast radius, and also just like other parts of nature, for sure, is just non-negotiable. It's going to happen, physics. So there's that. But there's also like the only two times that human beings have used it was in the theater of war, right? So it was like, it was designed in a war to be used in a war, and we have lived under the shadow of threat of nuclear war ever since. And I grew up in the Cold War in the US, so for me as a child, this was like the scariest thing that could ever happen to human beings. As a nuke, like a rogue nuke situation, or nukes getting out of control and just decimating entire countries.
And very unfortunately, recently we've been living more or less through that kind of fear, and we're still living through that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is like everybody freaks out about AI, and I'm like, there's all these nukes still, it's like thousands and thousands of them, and like lots of countries have them that maybe shouldn't, and it's too late now. Like we can't put that genie back in the bottle. So that was over here in my most extreme example of a technology that like, you just wouldn't use a nuke for something good. Maybe you would if like aliens were coming, or an asteroid that was attacking Earth, and the only way we could stop it would be if we like launched a nuke out in space to blow up the asteroid. This is how I talk with little kids about tech ethics, and they're like, they get it. They're like, yeah, use the nuke against the asteroid. Maybe not the alien though, but we would want to talk with them first, perhaps. So
but perhaps let's not just assume immediately that they would come here to wipe us out,
nice.
and we would be preemptively killing another life form. Or
exactly.
I mean, come on, let's just give them a chance. So.
Exactly, that's my view as well. In case they're listening. But then the other extreme, I was like, well, what's the other extreme? And I got really into looking at nature when I was on my walks. And of course, this led to animals who use tools, because like humans are not the only species that make tools.
Yeah.
which is so cool. You can really go down a rabbit hole with this. And I did. I went down that rabbit hole so that you don't have to, and looked at all of the different ways that animals fashion tools. And of course, this starts to become, if you're interested in the history of what differentiates human beings from our other ape chimpanzee brethren, one of the big questions was human beings make tools. That's like a defining characteristic of what it means to be human, which is kind of trippy if you think about, well, so do crows. So like,
Yeah.
why is that about making us human? But it just is. And so that was one of the things when Jane Goodall was doing her amazing research about chimpanzees, and she wrote to her then PhD supervisor to describe what she was observing, and he wrote back saying, either we have to redefine what a tool is, or we have to redefine what man is. And I was like, oh, there's something in this. And so it was like, well, what are those animals doing? And what were we doing? So they were doing something along the lines of what I call a found tool. So they would find an object in nature, a stone, a branch, and they would fashion it in some way to make a weapon. Usually it's used to hunt for food
Yeah.
rather than harm others, trapping food, etc. But it showed like advanced cognitive abilities. So I was like,
Yep.
okay, they're taking something that exists already and they're fashioning it in some way and they're coming up with really interesting uses for it. And there's a number of species that do it, of which we are one. So let's call that like the most, even fire potentially could be viewed as neutral in the sense that it exists in nature. Like you can just look over in Canada right now where you're just getting these spontaneous wildfires because of the heat, or when lightning strikes the earth, it can spark fires. So that can exist in nature. So we didn't like invent fire, nature invented fire. We just figured out how to like harness it and then deliberately create conditions in which fire appears.
Right.
So I took that thinking and went back to the atomic bomb thinking and was like,
Okay.
okay, what do we mean by the atomic bomb? Because there's a whole process. You don't just start with an atomic bomb. They're incredibly difficult to build, thank God, given the harm that they can do. So I started reading, honestly, it's like bringing back all these weird pandemic memories, but I spent like months and months reading about the journey to make that bomb. And the scientists who started out working on it were not doing it to make a weapon,
Right.
which I think is important. Because what you want to do is you want to identify where from like the first discovery to the first detonation over Hiroshima and the Nagasaki, where in that line do you cross a line and it stops being neutral? So I was like, okay, the scientists who are just looking to understand what happens when you bombard uranium, that's just like pure science. And the information of that, the fact of that exists in nature. Whether or not we ever discovered it as humans, it would exist because again, it's physics. So when does it start to become a weapon? And I identified in the book that it becomes a weapon in the mind of a brilliant Hungarian scientist, Leo Szilard, as he was walking down the street here in London. He attended a lecture, I think in 1938, and he suddenly had this idea of how to do it. And because he was friends with everyone, he's an amazing man. His book, Genius in the Shadows, it's a book about his life, is really worth reading to discover like the networking of science and how an idea goes from idea to weapon, or hopefully idea to vaccine, or idea to, wonderful cure that will save us all from climate change. So he goes and talks to Einstein about it, and because both of them were Central European and Jewish, which I think is also very important, they recognized the threat of Hitler far earlier than their American counterparts did. And they were like, A, you could do this with the scientific information that we now have about how to split the atom. You could do this and you could weaponize it, and we think that Hitler will. So we'd better have a plan in place. And because Einstein was able, due to his incredible status as a Nobel Prize winner, to get an audience with the then US President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, they explained this to him, laid it out. And then FDR greenlit the deal, if you will, to create what became the Manhattan Project, which ended up involving over 1,000 scientists and massive budget, and became a military project, and scientists from all over the world worked on it. So you're like, so was it FDR that did it because he gave like the political nous, if you will, and power and approval and money? Was it Einstein who like formed the bridge, because Leo Szilard could have had the idea. We all have great ideas, but like that doesn't necessarily lead to them being executed. So there's like a chain. It was like Szilard, Einstein, FDR. FDR then tasked Vannevar Bush, who is like head of all of America's totally cool World War II science stuff. Another fascinating person to read about. Was it Robert Oppenheimer, now subject of a major movie, who led, who like literally ran the Manhattan Project. All of it was absolutely fascinating for me to like, I had to build out the map of who was working on it. You know, you could ultimately be like, no, all of those things could have happened, and it actually comes down to the pilots who flew the plane and dropped the 2 bombs, because they were the last kind of line of defense who could have, I don't know, made an ethical protest and done what many people wanted by that point, which was a demonstration of the bomb, but not on a human population. You could have dropped it out in the ocean to let people see what it was capable of doing, and hopefully then that would have made Japan surrender. That was like an actual idea that was being put forward, but by that point, the new president, Harry Truman, was like, no, we have to do this, because he was given statistics saying, if we don't drop this bomb and the fighting continues for another 18 months, which were the predictions, however many people will die, and it was in the millions. So he was weighing up his ethical calculus, right?
Yeah.
And it's easy for all of us to judge these things now, knowing what we know now. But back then, they didn't know, and they had to make a call, and they'd already been fighting war for a really long time. And, you know, we can argue about that, and people do argue about that until the cows come home. So for me, I didn't want to argue about it. I wanted to sort of forensically map it, because I can see it happening again.
Right.
I can see it happening in all sorts of different things. And I don't mean in the sense of it's leading to death. I mean, I can see it happening again in that we are in this incredible moment of flourishing scientifically and technologically. This is an amazing time. Like, people will write about this, I think, centuries later from now, that this was like a real turning point moment in human science and technology evolution. And so what I'm hoping to do, and many people are working on this, I'm just like one tiny little person, but what I'm hoping to do as a historian in training is like write the history of the future, which is like, okay, so if we've got AI now, what can we learn from the atomic bomb exercise that we just went through, you and I here today, to understand who's working, for instance, on AI, although it could also be genetic engineering. It could be any technology, put it in. The whole point is it should work for anything. Who's working on it? What are the ethical decisions that are in play? Who has the power to actually get things done, or more importantly, to stop something, right?
Right.
All of that stuff. And also, who doesn't have the power? Who's just on the receiving end of this? Because, like, you know, the atomic crisis, if you will, that resulted from 1945, I think helped a lot of people to understand that this is something that affects all of humanity, but not all of humanity was involved in the design and deployment considerations. And even with nuclear arms control, even today, certain countries have a greater voice in that than others. And that matters, because you hear with people talking about AI governance, and they're like, we should have an international atomic energy agency like exists today in Vienna to look at nuclear technology. We should have something like that for AI. And it's like, well, okay, let's just check that interesting idea. Let's examine that. Is the IAEA actually a good example, a template, a model for us to use to govern AI? And like, we need to interview the people who are working on it and also their critics and come up with that view. I've seen some people really dismiss it. You also saw a bunch of people saying we should have a CERN for AI research. So CERN being the particle physics laboratory that's based on the French-Swiss border, has physicists again from around the world, and it's public science, if you will, public interest science. So you would want to talk with CERN and be like, okay, like, we have an example. We've run the CERN experiment now for 50, 60 years. Do you think that's actually relevant and appropriate? If it isn't, could we do better with an AI research lab? What would that look like to make it fair, equitable, representative, more democratic? How do we factor in things like climate and biodiversity, which we didn't necessarily in the early atomic discussions, but actually really matter? That sort of thing. So I think there's a lot we can learn from the history of this found technology, if it's just something that's out there versus something that you very deliberately set out to make, like an atomic bomb. And most of us, when we're making technology or using it or investing in it or buying it, are not ever going to have to face the extremes of an atomic weapon, but we'll probably be somewhere closer from we just found something and we like fashioned it, or we're deliberately creating something that's probably more middle of the road between those two. So that's a really long example, but I think it's quite important because you can't really rush through talking about nuclear technology. And it matters because now we're having this big conversation globally about how to regulate AI. And the thing that people keep coming back to again and again and again is the nuclear war threat. They also cite the pandemic threat, given that we've all just lived through that. I think we all had a very upfront, close and personal stress test of pandemic governance and health governance and bio laboratory governance, right? Like, was this a virus that was manufactured in a lab? Was it something that came from nature? Like, this is something that's still being discussed. Scientists are still evolving their views on that. And even if it is something that was found in nature, it still raises the issue of these labs, right? And like how the ethics of bioengineering, that all comes from World War II. All of that thinking, medical ethics, all of it really got an update from World War II. So if you want to think about the technologies of the future, knowing your Second World War science and technology studies history from the Second World War onwards, I think is essential.
Right.
You know, you can't be talking about AI today in the abstract. You have to know. We've already seen scientists taking ethical stances and doctors taking ethical stances. Some people have said that AI should be regulated more like the Food and Drug Agency in the United States. Like you can't just roll out a drug onto the American population. It has to go through extremely rigorous testing, right? And God forbid, when we're talking about global pharmaceutical manufacturing or global research, or like research on the human body or embryos and stem cell tissue, right? Like there's entire governance structures set up for this that come from, weirdly, a World War II starting framework, because that's when we saw not just this potentially positive, but also controversial narrative around atomic weapons, but also a lot of the Nazi medical experiments and bio research experiments, which were absolutely horrific, right? So all of that thinking is there. So if you don't know that thinking, you're doing the classic thing that tech people do, which is like, oh, what if we invented this thing? And you're like, you've invented something that's literally already existed and that people have been working on for decades. Like, do your literature review before you start talking, right? Which is so classic, so classic. But if you go to
But I mean, let me just ask you one question about all of what you've just said. So, you've talked mostly about nuclear weapons, and you also added the discovery of nuclear fission, for example. And I was wondering if you think that perhaps certain scientific discoveries themselves might not be neutral, because I mean we could just say. And I'm not pointing fingers at anyone that studies or studied nuclear fission. I mean, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's perfectly fine to understand how atoms work and all of that, and the same for how genes work, for example. But at the same time, isn't it the case that, first of all, people who are making the scientific discoveries themselves are people, and they have their own motivations, and their work is usually paid for by governments or private institutions, and that's also not random or usually not arbitrary. I mean, if they pay for something, they have particular goals in mind. They want certain developments instead of others. They want to acquire certain knowledge instead of some other knowledge. So could you think or say that certain scientific discoveries are themselves not neutral, even though they are just at first sight producing useful knowledge? Or
Well, I think it's probably important to differentiate between the discovery
okay.
and what leads to it. So
Oh, okay.
back in the day when I thought that technology was neutral before I wrote a book that changed my own mind, it, I was coming from the sort of technology, digital perspective, and I was like, this is math. This is mathematics.
Yeah.
And you'll hear that a lot. Like Gary Kasparov, the chess grandmaster who wrote a book on AI called Deep Thinking, was like on Twitter a few years ago, and I cite him in the book saying ethical AI is like ethical electricity. Like electricity is just electricity. Like he was kind of like, what is this?
Yeah.
This argument. And I understand what he means, and you see it a lot. I follow Twitter obsessively, and I'm constantly watching people argue about code is neutral, math is neutral, and all these people are trying to talk about values, but math has no values. It's like the universal language. And I understand that, just like a phenomenon that exists in chemistry or a phenomenon that exists in physics, again, putting the atom, has, like, doesn't care what my politics are or who writes my paycheck, right? Like it just exists. It's knowledge. So I think that part is neutral. Something that just exists is neutral in the natural physical world. That doesn't mean that motivations for seeking that knowledge out are irrelevant, because I think they are relevant. Absolutely, the funding model. I mean, we're seeing this right now with AI. Like, most people can't afford to build large language models. There's this whole thing of like elite capture and whether or not we're going to have like a new monopoly of these things, which is why we're getting a lot of pushback, and some people are wanting to release them as open source now. What data goes into the training sets, all of this stuff, the intellectual property thereof, can these things be audited or not? And should they be, particularly if they're involved in public procurement of any kind, or like public service use of any kind. So I think we're sophisticated enough as a species where we can have this conversation and go, if you are doing something, if you're seeking out knowledge and doing research on behalf of shareholders for a company, or a private company, or a government, governments are completely value laden. So of course it matters if you're doing it for the US government versus the Chinese government versus, let's pick Switzerland, which claims to be neutral. Although that's an interesting country to tackle on that claim. Of course these things matter. So I feel like we can separate out the neutrality of the fact, like, oh wow, if you cut off my finger, this is what happens. Like, a finger being removed from its hand produces X numbers of physical responses, and we can observe them and describe them forensically and repeat that experiment and hopefully stop cutting people's fingers off because we've answered those questions. The why of doing that, the who of doing that, the for what purpose are we going to use that knowledge? Is it, maybe we're chopping off fingers for a really good reason. Maybe we're doing it just to be awful. Like, all of those questions are relevant and matter, and we can use them to do science potentially in a more ethical way. And like, I know that's a really problematic statement for a lot of people, and it should be. I'm delighted that it's a problematic statement because it means that our thinking is like switched on and we're all going to go, what does that mean to do more ethical science? What does it mean to do ethical technology or ethical AI? And we see that with AI, right? I cannot think of another technology where so many people have been in such a hurry to claim that it's trustworthy, responsible, reliable, ethical. We don't feel the need to do that. And it's because I think people understand, we've matured enough as a species to understand that AI is inherently not neutral, that we have to rush out to brand it as trustworthy or responsible because people are terrified. And there's a reason for that. There are some really scary uses you could put this technology to. So you need to reassure people up front that, we're just using it for, I don't know, whatever it is people want to be using it for. It seems to be, again, largely for advertising and marketing, but there's a lot more. Drug discovery would be a great one. But even then, we could discover some really trippy stuff with that. And it's going to be, what do we do with it? What do we do with that knowledge? You can't unknow something once you know it.
Yeah. But I mean, explain a little bit better why, in certain instances, technology, AI systems, for example, can be biased. I mean, they can have, for example, sexual, racial bias or biases of any other kind, because there are people that, particularly when it comes, for example, to how certain police departments in the US use systems to fight against crime, I guess they frame it that way. People just rely on the data those systems generate, and they say, oh, you're just feeding them data and they're processing the data, and then they help the police. I mean, when it comes to they have limited resources, and they have, in terms of when it comes for them to decide which particular areas they should police more or less. So it's not biased at all. It's just a computer processing data. But I mean, that's not really the case.
Oh no, I mean it's totally biased. It's completely biased. And like that's the tricky thing. So you're right to highlight things like facial recognition technology, because that's going to be regulated under the EU AI Act. And this whole question of, can you just have real-time identity surveillance, right? So people walking around like you see in the movies, and you and I'd be walking down the street in a little square with a pair above our head, and it would be like Stephanie Hare and Ricardo Lopez are walking down the street going into a coffee shop, and they would have like our height and our weight and our eye color, but potentially more, how we voted in our last election, whether or not one of us has credit card debt. Pick your fantasy information profile about yourself, or your nightmare profile about your political, our sexuality. Last pornography was looked at yesterday, right? Because all that stuff is being tracked. All of it's being tracked. So yes, that exists. It's there. The EU is looking to take a position not to do that. We use it here in the United Kingdom, where I'm talking to you from. The London Metropolitan Police loves facial recognition technology. For reasons that are really bewildering, because it doesn't seem to improve their performance at all, but they insist on using it, despite Parliament asking them repeatedly not to. But that's what happens when you don't pass laws making something, banned or controlling it. You just kind of go, please don't do it, and the police just ignore it. No. In the US, we've done a really different approach, which is that certain cities or towns or states have put into law rules about using it or not using it. And who can use it? Is it the cops? Or do you also need to regulate private sector use? Because one thing you could do is you could ban the police from using it, but allow the private sector to carry on. Because remember, we must upset the private sector in the US. But the problem is the police can then just work around that and buy the data, or sometimes just get it for free. But why get it for free when someone can make money off of it? You can buy the data from a third-party data broker legally. So they're still getting the data, and we see this with Amazon Ring is a great example of this. People putting all those doorbells up, needing to identify everybody, have no idea that footage can actually just be taken by the cops. There's nothing stopping it. So like, well done for participating in a surveillance society in your neighborhood. It's just happening. So that question sounds like, well, so what? Nothing to hide, nothing to fear, right? Like, I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't care if I'm being observed. I hear this all the time. And it's like, okay, cool. But the problem is that this technology tends to perform better on men with lighter skin and worst on women with darker skin. So we've had a number of wrongful arrests in the United States in which the police have used facial recognition technology to make arrests, like as part of their arrest process, and they have misidentified people who were innocent. So these people get subject to really traumatic arrests, often in front of their family. They might be held in custody for 36, 92 hours, something horrific. And anybody who hasn't, who thinks, oh, that's not so bad, has obviously never been in a US police custody situation. It's not something you would do voluntarily. No disrespect to law enforcement. It's not nice to be treated as a suspected criminal. Yeah. And particularly if you're innocent. And then there's also the problem that there's no legal requirement in the United States when you are, when you've been arrested and brought to trial, you don't have to be told. There's no requirement to protect you, telling you that facial recognition was used in your arrest, which is really problematic for a technology that doesn't work very well. So all of that is really bad. But then people will go, okay, cool. So what we have to do to fix all of those, acknowledge risks, it's really bad. Let's just pump it full of more data, refine, and get to a tool that works. It's never going to work 100% of the time, but like with high degree of accuracy, 99% of accuracy. So you're like, all right, if you solve the accuracy problem, have you solved the problem of facial recognition? I personally have argued that you do not. Why? Because now you've got your cameras that apparently are pretty accurate everywhere. Because, and we've seen this in the US is a great case in point. It isn't just the cops who want it. People are like, well, I don't feel very confident. We've got high gun crime in the United States, or we're in schools, or fill in the blank, whatever your personal security concerns are. I'm going to get a camera and put it everywhere. So now imagine a United States in which private individuals have cameras in their homes. Every business has cameras. Cities get in on the act because like, we'll do this to fight crime. And you now have it where people are being surveyed nonstop. You would actually have to almost flip it and say, where are they not being surveyed, right? And where is that data not being kept, recorded, traded? You know, who owns the cameras? So here in the UK, we have a problem that a lot of the CCTV cameras that we have all over this country are very awkwardly sourced from China. And so a big campaign has gone to rip them out because this is now finally being deemed to be a security risk. And then the question becomes, okay, so is it the fact that the camera is made by a Chinese company, is that the security risk? Or is the act of having these cameras up at all a security risk? Like, would you feel more comfortable if the camera making it was a British company, right? And I think a lot of people, to be completely frank, they would be fine with that. For them, the issue is it's a known hostile power. I mean, China has been identified as one of the biggest national security risks to the UK. So you get into these situations where you can just tell nobody's thought this through because. And you always have to do this. And again, this is like my historian training. You have to always imagine whatever system you're building in your peaceful, liberal, democratic, happy country being weaponized if somebody gets elected who is awful. Now, the classic example would be like, what if Hitler had all of this tech, right? But, let's not give that man any more time and attention than he's already had. You don't have to go back to World War II to look at examples of countries that have become increasingly, how can we say this, cracking down on women's reproductive rights. That happened in the United States right now, right? Like we don't have to go to World War II. We can literally just open the newspaper today and see that women who need to get abortions or to go to an abortion clinic or a reproductive clinic simply to get health advice are now being criminalized in several US states, as are the people that help them. Their friends, their mothers, whatever. And that was something that has always been a threat. But then I think most people, if you had said before Roe versus Wade was challenged successfully, if you had told them this could be a risk, they would have looked at you like you were, some crazy feminist. Well, here you are, crazy feminist. Like, it's happened, right? Like, it's happened. Yeah. And so you've got your phone data, all of your internet data, right? So like Facebook has had problems, Meta has had problems because they've been handing over data to cops to arrest women who need to go and get an abortion. And if you had told somebody that when Facebook came on the scene in the mid-2000s, they would not have believed you. I'm sure that Mark Zuckerberg and his designing crew never thought that would be a risk because no one imagined the US political context changing in that way. You can imagine it with the LGBTQIA plus community, which again is constantly under threat, not just in the US, but like everywhere in terms of their right to get married, their right to adopt, just their right to not be like harassed and persecuted on the street. You are now going to have all of this surveillance equipment that potentially could be put in the hands of a democratically elected government that is bad. Right, and bad in the sense of like would persecute them. And that's, that's my view, that's bad. I know there's people that would disagree with that and I don't care.
I bet that Dissenters in Florida would love that.
Yeah, no, they absolutely would love it. They would love it. So like you have to design for that in mind. And that's where like sci-fi training and like a very good, healthy background in literature and cinema can be really helpful because it helps you to imagine scenarios that will seem crazy at the time and be like, yeah, but what if? how many steps away, or again, like, and that's why one of the chapters in my book is where do you draw the line? I'm like, how many steps do you have before your liberal democracy turns into like fascism or simply authoritarianism or like a Christian theocracy or, you know, whatever. It doesn't have to be Christian, it can be any religion, but like that matters. And those rights that we have in so many liberal democracies are so precious, and they have been so fought and hard won, and they're also so easily taken away. And that's where you must know your history, because if you don't know history, someone will say, yeah, but you know, you're just worrying about nothing. And you need to be able to go, no, this has already happened, or it happened in this way. And actually here, in this case, we're only, you know, it would only take 2 or 3 steps for us to enter that world. So how do I design for that? I mean, a really good strategist and a really good technology designer, a technology ethicist, can't simply rely on a technological background. You must have the social sciences and, you know, liberal arts and humanities training as well. I think it's one of the toughest jobs to do, actually. And that's no disrespect to engineering colleagues or more sort of classically trained STEM colleagues. Their work is also extremely challenging and difficult, but there's something especially hard about the human component. Right? People don't use things necessarily the way they were intended, or they modify them because, again, it's just in our nature. So you have to always design with the worst in mind. And that means you have to have incredible knowledge and a really good imagination and like a humility to think about your own blind spots, right? Which is why you don't want monocultural teams. You have to have people with really different experiences, and those different views have to be really respected, because those people will help you see risk that you would just miss. You won't hear it, you won't see it. You need somebody else who's like, I know what this is like because I am of this community, or I'm from this country and I saw this, or my country lived through this. That's a tough one.
But you mentioned sci-fi there, and I mean, I understand all of your arguments, but I have to say that at least to some extent, and unless I'm misunderstanding what you're saying there about sci-fi, I might have some issue with people looking into or relying on, I don't know, something that is portrayed in a sci-fi movie or sci-fi book when it comes to worrying about the potential dangers of technology, AI, or something like that. Because, I mean, for example, if you think that the things you should be worried about are, I don't know, Terminator-like scenarios or Westworld-like scenarios where technology suddenly becomes sentient and develops their own motives and goals and all of that, and suddenly wants to wipe out humanity, or perhaps the next day we have to be worried about mistreating AI systems because they might be sentient and all of that. I mean, I just worry that if people take those kinds of scenarios too seriously, they might that might help distract them from the actual more realistic issues that might derive from technology, you know. I mean, do you understand what I'm worried about here?
I completely understand it. And that's been a concern that a lot of people have raised in the past couple of months, ever since people started writing those letters saying we should have a pause in AI research, and warning of the different risks that it presents on an existential societal level. And that group of people who are worried about existential risks of AI have been accused of worried about something that may never happen, because it's not really AI that they're worried about. They're worried about artificial general intelligence, which is a different beast, in the sense that that's the moment that, again, it's hypothetical. It has not happened, and it may never happen, but in theory, it's the moment when smart machines become smarter than human beings. I love how I said that, and the dog just barked. That's hilarious. The robot dog. Smart machines, when these machines become more intelligent than us.
Yeah.
as a species, and like what would they do to us is the big fear. And there is a concern that that's distracting from what I guess you could call now risks. If you have
Yeah.
existential risks, you could have now risks, which
Or,
are,
or even near future
yeah,
risks.
quite of, it's either it's happening now, and here's, the risks of discrimination in like how AI is used in healthcare, how AI is used in the medical, or sorry, the legal profession, or risks of misinformation and disinformation in terms of elections and journalism and like public confidence and the integrity of how the citizen state relationship works. That's all happening right now.
Or selling your online data, for example.
It's selling your online data,
Yeah.
gathering your data. I mean, like literally a month doesn't go by when Meta isn't being fined for some sort of data violation, and they just, they just price it in, and everybody uses their stuff. It's incredible to me, but they do. So that's all happening now, and then you're right to identify like near-term risks, which is like we're not quite there as of risks.
Yeah,
Weighing those two
perhaps a good example, of that would be certain genetic engineering technologies. I mean, we're not really there yet, but it's probably in the near future. So,
yeah, you could come up with, I'm sure, a number of different categories to kind of like, make columns, if you will. So definitely need to worry about this now because it's already happening, likely to happen soon, but we're not there yet. And here's the conditions that we would have to fulfill to get there
yeah,
versus like may never happen, but if they did, call them low probability, high impact events, e.g. AGI takes over. And what will they do to us and turn us into slaves or something? So is that distracting is your question. I don't know. First of all, I don't think that you're going to I don't think it's like helpful to tell people not to think about something because they're going to think about it. It's like, that experiment of don't think of the white polar bear. As I'm
yeah,
telling you to do this, your brain is like, all I can think of is a white polar bear. So I think first of all, it's actually probably, I'm not a cognitive psychologist, but my guess would be the easiest thing to do is actually to name it. Like do what we just did. Be like, there's these different types of risks. The one that the media really loves to go for is the one that's actually the least likely. Why do they like to go for it? Because it's great storytelling. We've literally seen this movie before. So
yeah,
I talk with clients a lot, and I've got a presentation that I've been using the past couple of months that has really like driven people wild in a good way, that is looking at cinema. And we talk about the different ways that AI appears in cinema over time. And it's so effective because you can't have a conversation about AI without naming Terminator. You just can't. So I make it the first slide. I'm like, let's name it. Let's dismantle it and deconstruct it like a bomb, take it apart, neutralize it, if you will, and then talk about why it's so resonant. Everybody has a really good laugh and just kind of like looks around like, I'm not the only one who thinks about Terminator. No, we all think about Terminator. Why is that? And then you move on. You would maybe talk about The Matrix. You might talk about Blade Runner. You could talk about Westworld. You could talk about Black Mirror, right? So you go through all the different things that are in popular culture, and you also look at the imagery, right? So it's not just the story, it's the pictures. So like the Terminator, what's quite terrifying about the Terminator is he's both human, although he's like a Supermensch, he's Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he's also, when he like rips off all of his fleshy bits, he is made, the designers very cleverly in the movie, made it to look like a human technological skeleton. So it's like a metal head. It's literally a metal skull, and it has teeth. Like it has actual human teeth. And you're like, why? Like, why does it need human teeth? It's a robot. It does not eat. So what is that about? And the reason is because it's terrifying, right? It's really scary. If you saw that when you were a kid, you were like unable to not ever see it again. So you have to think about why that is, or like the image of like a human hand kind of going like that to another human hand, and it's riffing off of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, right, of God touching Adam and giving the spark of life.
right.
And you'll see that image a lot when we talk about AI, because it's a really useful shorthand visually for us to think about, God, something, but people call it God in the Judeo-Christian sense with that picture, created humans. And so then they'll riff on it, and you'll see another image of a human hand touching a robot finger, right? Like it's going like that. And then in this case, humans have become God, and the robot is our creation. And that taps into one of the best science fiction films of all time, or movies, or books rather, of all time, which is of course Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Like this idea that you can create it and then it goes rogue. And it's a fascinating piece of literature that I think captured something in, again, humans, because we create things all the time, and it's this sort of primal fear of what happens when our creations come back and like kill us, which probably actually is about like parents with their children, right? Like it's in a really demented way. But I'm talking subconscious stuff, right? Stuff
Yeah.
that works across all societies, that there's that fear of your creation getting out of control, because that's a narrative that we know, we recognize it
Yeah.
across time. So you have to, I think you actually, it's a wasted amount of energy to tell people don't think about these things. It's distracting. I think it's actually more effective to think about it right up front. Name it. Have a chat together. Build everybody's critical thinking images on the news. Whenever you talk about AI, I do a lot of work with the media. When I go on television, it'll be a split screen. It'll be me talking about AI with a bunch of books in the background, hopefully saying intelligent things. And then the images that they put on the other side of the screen to illustrate AI are like on drugs. They're like hallucinatory acid trips. It'll be like a light sort of floating, like when people say they almost die and they have like a near death experience, they're in a white tunnel going towards the light. So they'll show something like that.
Yeah.
Then they'll show like a video game graphic of a human head from the neck up that's completely translucent. You can see right through it. And inside is a human brain glowing orange, and it's like rotating around, and it's like floating on a magic carpet, like a video game version of a magic carpet. Why? Because I'm assuming it's because they're like, oh, if we're talking about artificial intelligence, we have to show, what do we think of intelligence? You think of a brain. So we'll show the viewers a brain, but like a sci-fi version of a brain. It's not like an actual brain, because an actual brain's a bit gross, right? It's sort of a biological wet thing. So they show you instead an abstraction of a brain. And then they might show the finger image, right? Like they riff on weird stuff. And once you see this, or you'll see like lots of zeros and ones raining down, right? Like in the Matrix.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. They're not, this is not an accident. These things are highly iconic images from the films and shows that we've all seen. So they become a visual shorthand. So I just think you can't ignore this stuff. I think you actually have to go right at it, straight at it, discuss it, and then you can, if you want, park it and go, let's actually look at the stuff that is perhaps less visually sexy, right? Less visually interesting to show, which is going to be predictive policing algorithms, facial recognition technology discrimination, banks using AI to decide if you can get a mortgage or not, right? Like that is less sci-fi sexy. It's less scary, but it's actually most people's experience of AI. So that's fascinating. Most people don't realize how AI is already being used on them, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think they would be kind of appalled if they did. So that's, I think, the media's challenge, and the challenge of writers and analysts and people who are trying to educate the public is like, you're going to need a visual iconography, if you will, a visual language, and you're going to need a narrative language for storytelling that makes those real risks that are right now, as compelling as the ones that are more hypothetical, but that we've all been seeing in shows and movies for decades now, right? So it's again, so many things with technology are actually about culture, right? They're about the human relationship with technology. So like getting people involved and caring about something like AI, which, we're in a cost of living crisis here in the UK. Good luck going out onto the streets of Britain
I guess
or
that,
Portugal, getting people to care.
yeah, I guess that across the entire globe we're living through a cost of living crisis.
Yeah, right. So if you're like, do you want to have this chat? People are like, no, because I'm too busy like dealing with massive inflation or like very high interest rates or unemployment or climate change. Like, half of Europe, as we were just discussing, is under a massive heat dome and sweltering away. So getting them to think about AI is tricky. So you have to help them. You have to make that really easy for them to do. And so that's where I really enjoy this kind of work, because I've noticed the effect that it has on people when you take them through some of the concepts that we've just been discussing. Is they're like, oh my God, I see this everywhere now. I see those images everywhere. I see the media loves to go to some stories and then not to others. Why is that? You have to look at their incentive structure. what do they get measured on? Clicks, viewing figures, etc. So the scarier they can make the story. That's why anytime Elon Musk does everything, the media loves it because they're in some sort of symbiotic relationship, right? He says something outrageous, they cover it, go, isn't it outrageous? He then is like, I hate the press. It's like the world's weirdest dysfunctional relationship ever.
Yeah.
But people who are doing like really important work on AI are not getting that kind of media coverage. Right? And they maybe don't talk the way that Elon Musk talks. They won't like give examples or say things that are really outrageous to get attention. If you're a really measured, considered scientist or researcher, you're not going to say something that's very clickbaity.
Yeah. And
Right?
by the way, since you mentioned that, let's talk a little bit more about social media, because it's not only the misinformation issue, but also in terms of this discussion surrounding the supposed neutrality of technology. I mean, if you just look at social media, it's patently obvious that there's no neutrality there at all. Because, I mean, even what you get mostly exposed to, it's just what they decide to boost to get more views, clicks, likes, whatever. And usually it's the most outrageous stuff out there, right?
And lies. I mean, there's fascinating research about how lies spread much faster than facts on the internet. And like, yeah, now we're in this world where so much of it can be faked, not just imagery and video footage, but sound, audio. So you're going to have this thing where people are going to find it very, very difficult to know what is real and not real. I don't know. I sometimes think that we may be approaching, if not the end of social media, it definitely a new phase. Do people really want to go online and see their friends talking about holidays and babies and lunch, which was a lot of how social media was from the mid 2000s onward. And now it seems to be kind of invaded by content creators,
Yeah.
influencers and the like. And then if you start feeling like, oh my God, if I go on, it's actually manipulating me, that's not good either. There's all the mental health research of, lots of people who spend time on social media end up feeling really depressed or anxious. And it can feel really toxic for many, many people just to go on. It could be awful. I just wonder, I don't know. I'm thinking aloud here, but I do wonder if there's just going to be a bunch of people for whom this starts to just feel really irrelevant, because it's kind of like, I don't know, the way that television, I just came back from the US and I'm always just stunned by American television now, the amount of advertising that you are just bombarded with. And it's, if you're not used to it, if you are in a country where you don't have a lot of advertising in your TV, you just kind of look at your American family and friends and you're like, you're just being like brainwashed with all of this all the time. And that's how social media feels. Like my Twitter feed since Elon Musk took over is just full of ads.
No, but since you talk about that, about American television, let me just tell you that I'm a wrestling fan. And so I watch wrestling mostly from the US, of course, because it's the biggest place for wrestling in the world. But I mean, I really notice that if you watched wrestling like 20 years ago, you would have the matches and then a few breaks with advertisements and all of that. But now you get split screens where there's a tiny window with the match and then next with the advertisement. And I'm like, come on, man, I want to watch the match. I don't care about pizzas and burgers and whatever. Let me just watch.
I feel that way when I go to the cinema, and it's like, I'm just here to see the movie and ideally the previews. And I feel like I pay quite a lot to go to the cinema. And then you have to sit through, 20 minutes of adverts, but then you work it out. And so you just show up later, right? So if you want, there's always ways of hacking. There's probably some way of like hacking your wrestling channel to only see the wrestling and not the ads. But I guess I'm just saying that I feel like these things evolve, and like social media for a while clearly had some sort of utility. It helped people feel connected, clearly. Yeah. But then it started to have, what would you call it if it's not utility? I was going to say negative utility, but again, like it has a cost to it. Mm-hmm. And I guess you're constantly weighing up in life, is the pain worth the pleasure, right? Like, is it helpful? And I just think for a lot of people, I mean, I've heard constantly, is this the end of Twitter? And like, I'm very mixed because I use Twitter, for instance, for my work quite a lot. But part of me was like, maybe the best thing that could happen to me is if Twitter like failed and died because I'm not on, other than LinkedIn, I'm not on any other social media channel. I managed to like break all of those addictions and habits from my youth. Twitter is like the last holdout. And in a way, it would just do me a huge favor if it just wasn't even an option, which is that's a weird feeling to have. On the one hand, I miss the old days of Twitter because I had a lot of fun. I made amazing contacts and friends on it, and it was really helpful to me for my work. But I do feel that it's not a very nice place. It's like going into, I was in Frankfurt Airport a couple of weeks ago, and they have like an old-fashioned smoking lounge in the airport, and it's like a glass cage for smokers. And if you're a non-smoker, which I am, you're walking by, you see all these people in, what looks basically like a cancer room. They're all sort of doping up, smoking. And like you just look at them and you're like, my God, it's expensive, it's dangerous, it's stinky. Like you're gonna come out of there absolutely reeking.
No, it's awful.
But like the compassion kicks in because it's one
Yeah.
of the hardest addictions to kick.
Yeah.
But rarely do you see it that way. And I kind of wonder if we're getting to a point where some people can either see themselves in the social media equivalent of the smoking lounge in Frankfurt Airport and be like, why are you doing this to yourself? Like, if these things make you feel so bad, why do you go on them? If you feel the news is unreliable or you just get shouted at by crazy people you've never met, why are you signing up for an emotional beating? Like, there's other ways to get your news that are probably more reliable and that don't involve that. So, all of us, I think, are going to have a real, and probably are already having, a sort of reckoning with a new relationship. And I think that could be a real challenge for the social media companies is if you just got a mass movement of people who were like, you know what, this isn't worth it anymore.
Yeah.
That's hard for them.
But by the way, related to that about collecting data online and selling people's data, because there are people out there that are perhaps still not sold on this idea that they should care about this because they're just like, oh, come on, I go on the internet and I go on Facebook and just see some of the news and share a few silly stuff. I mean, stuff related to my vacation or something like that, my kids, and perhaps I watch some vanilla porn and go on Amazon and buy some stuff. I mean, what's the big deal with their collecting that data, that data and then selling it to other people? I mean, I'm not doing anything bad, and I'm not overwhelmed on the internet with ads that I don't really care about because they're also catering to the things that I tend to like. So what's the big deal there?
So there's so many ways we could tackle that. I guess one that I would start out with is like, can they imagine, like, can they literally conceive of a world in which they aren't having all of their data gathered? Because like that's an option, right? That's a design choice that we've all made. We could have a world in which you can't track me from site to site to site, or which third-party brokers are like just not allowed to exist, much less traffic in our data for profit. And it's true, like I struggle with this because I think most people have just priced in that they're going to have their data involved in a data hack or leak.
Yeah.
At some point, and like what's the worst that happens to them is maybe a little bit of casual identity theft, perhaps a bit of fraud, which hopefully their banks will cover, right? So that if you look at where the incentives are to care about this, I don't know how much it is on the individual. Banks care about it because they want to stop fraud. Governments care about it because they also need to stop identity fraud for all sorts of security reasons. But like, do individuals care? And I'm with you. I think the example that you just gave of the person who's like going through the journey of sharing their data is kind of a personal preference at this point. Some people really care about it. Other people don't. I think you could make it more of like a consumer protection competition issue to say, I don't even really have a choice. So I might care about it, but the regulators aren't doing a good enough job because there's no way for me to have options to choose to create an online experience for myself because I have to be online that doesn't involve this. But there's also the whole factor the whole question in mind of so much of how we've allowed everything to work is for free, but it isn't really for free because your data is the product that's being trafficked and traded for a profit.
Yep.
If you remove that, do I have to pay to compensate for it, right? So if I want to have ad-free listening on my favorite podcast, that option exists, but I have to join the podcast and pay a subscription because fair enough, the podcast creators like have bills to pay as well. And they're like, listen, we either get paid from ads or subscription. You decide. And like, that's what was interesting with Twitter is I think Elon Musk tried to go down that path by getting people to pay, £8 a month to be verified because he was saying he wanted to do it that way, which was slightly flawed because Twitter's revenue model was largely advertising based, as it is for indeed most of the platforms. And the subscription model doesn't really seem to work with any of those. And it's also really difficult to get people to pay for something they've had for free for a really long time. Howls of protest. People don't even want to pay for good journalism. So you'll constantly see people bitching online going, this article is behind a paywall, not understanding. I guess they don't understand the cost of good journalism and that like reporters have to be paid, editors have to be paid. They just want it for free. So people always want stuff for free and they won't pay for it. So I think in that case, for the majority of people like that, they won't care. And to be honest, I'm not even sure that they should care, which is a controversial statement to make because they have almost no power to get it fixed. I think the people who do have power and who do care, who have like an incentive to care, are the big companies looking to bust fraud. Yep. And they lobby like mad. So they could actually lobby for a safer internet if they wanted to. And in fact, instead what they're doing is just upping the amount of, anti-fraud protections that you would have to use when you're doing online banking, for instance. You might get like you'll buy something online and then you'll get a code to your phone from your bank checking that you actually wanted to make this purchase, right? Like that's a new mechanism, or getting people to have multi-factor authentication to check that it's really them doing something. So we haven't come up with a way around this. And I think that's because, again, the ultimate extreme example of risk is you build this massive surveillance capitalism model, or the Chinese social credit system model of surveillance. In the liberal democratic world, we haven't yet had, unfortunately, a pretty grim test run, which would be a bad government getting elected into power who then weaponizes all of the information that's gathered on all of us. And because humans seem to need to see risks before they can decide to then, oh God, we better fix that and make sure that doesn't happen again, it's very difficult for them to think ahead and prevent something from happening. I don't see that going away anytime soon. It would be really nice if we did, because honestly, the cost to society of fraud and identity theft is massive. And we have a new generation that's been coming on really since the early 2000s, who all of their life, so much of their life, more than any other human in history, is online. So the risk is not proportionate. If you're a baby boomer, the majority of your life is not online.
Yeah.
If you're Generation Z, almost all of it is, or not all of it, that's unfair, that's an exaggeration. Let's just call it a
I mean, I can tell you that I have a little brother who is 10 years younger than me, and he's basically lived with internet his entire life. I mean, I started using internet when I was 9-10 years old, but he lived with internet his entire life.
Yeah,
so.
Been posting pictures of them for years. That they have an internet presence that they weren't even aware of. I mean, that can create all sorts of existential angst and emotional problems about privacy and sharing, and who has to share your image or your story or your information. That's probably another reason that we haven't really evolved yet, is I think as that generation comes of age, and they are coming of age now, and only will continue to do so, they may have different views on this. Whereas I think for the baby boomers and possibly Generation X even, who are largely in positions of power, it hasn't affected them as much. It'd be interesting to talk with your little brother, or indeed anybody who's of that younger generation, to feel, I think they have really different notions of privacy and culture around sharing and consent. So on the one hand, they have less privacy, but I think they're also much more alive to this question of consent and what that means and why the consent model doesn't even always work. I still come down to, I think it's a very old school problem. I think regulators have really failed on competition because if you don't want to be tracked by Facebook across the internet, it just doesn't matter. The regulatory fines, well, they
Yeah.
can pay the fines. Like that model has to be updated to deal with giants who can afford to pay fines and actually are really happy to do that as long as you don't interfere with their operating model. What we actually have to do is make it so that they can't do that legally in the first place. You know, if Mark Zuckerberg literally faced criminal charges and could like do jail
Yeah.
time for that, I'm sure he would change his model. But since he just has to write a check,
Yeah, I mean, because those fines, they don't hurt their profits at all.
yeah,
Come on, let's be real, right?
completely. I mean, in fact, I still remember with horror, the FTC had issued what was then the biggest fine against Facebook for privacy violations, and Facebook's share price went up. Didn't hurt them.
My
It
God.
went up. Why did it go up? It went up because people had been worried that the FTC might actually take action on their data gathering practices, but they
Yeah,
didn't. So they were like, super. If you're telling me that all you're going to do is find me, then I can build that into my financial modeling
yeah,
and call it a tax. Just pay it and carry on, which is what they
yeah,
do. And so that's going to be the question is like, we were talking about Threads with Meta coming up with this new social media platform to rival Twitter and the like. And I was fascinated by how many people signed up and were talking about it. It was like, have you forgotten who is behind all of this? These are the same people who were complaining
yeah,
when Frances Haugen blew the whistle on mental health abuses by
yeah,
Facebook, Instagram on children. And they're the same people who freaked out when Facebook was involved with Cambridge Analytica and rigging the US election in 2016, you know, all thinking that Mark Zuckerberg is awful. But as soon as he put this out, because he's not Elon Musk and it became this thing, like they had a total memory wipe and they all signed up, not thinking, I wonder why this isn't allowed to be released in the European Union yet. Right. So
yeah,
like we were just talking about the fact that you can't get it there because the amount of data that Threads harvests is huge. And we know that these people are not going to be using it for good. They're using it for profit. And yet people signed up. So like that was again, as a technology ethicist, I was fascinated because I was like, all of that you can give people all the information in the world and they will still make bad choices. Like it's not enough to give them information and it's not enough to remind them again and again and again. That need to have a social media life seems to be really strong in a lot of people. Because we saw it first with Mastodon, then we saw it with Blue Sky, now it's Threads. Like it's this thing and it never seems to get the critical mass that may have changed by the time this podcast go out. They'll have a spike in early adoption and then it kind of falls off. And that's what I mean about kind of looking to the long term is like, are people actually going to want this? Because what need does it serve? And is the price too high to pay?
yeah.
Very fascinating. I
But
don't know.
by the way, since earlier you mentioned that you wrote your book during the COVID-19 pandemic, I would also like to ask you, what is your idea about some of the digital health tools that were used during the COVID-19 pandemic? Because of course we were dealing with a major health issue and perhaps even if there was some data collection, I mean, it would still be ethical to do that. The pros would outweigh the cons because of the threat we were dealing with. But what do you think about some of the data that were potentially collected by, I guess, governments mostly during that period?
That's interesting, isn't it? Like, we haven't really had all of the different countries that built that kind of health surveillance tech, if you will, come out as a group. I don't mean individually, but as a group or through the auspices of the WHO, the World Health Organization, to say,
Yeah.
like, if we have another pandemic, God forbid, in a few years' time, is this a tool that we want to have in our toolbox? E.g., was it effective or not? And not only was it effective, was it worth it? Which is a different question.
Yeah.
The UK has had some studies that came out arguing that it reduced transmission, but I still question some of that because we can't really run a couple of other sort of counterfactual experiments. Like What would it be like if we hadn't used it? There's a lot of problems still with some of the things that I book. And I also just think I interviewed loads of doctors while I was writing that chapter, and none of them were asking for this. Like, this was not the tool, this was not the mitigations that they felt they needed. The most effective mitigations were the lockdowns, unfortunately, and then obviously the big one was vaccines. But doctors weren't calling for this. It really felt for me like a solution in search of a problem, in the sense that this massive crisis happened, technologists wanted to do something, investors saw a potential to make money from it, and like, voila, let's go for it. And you saw in the case of Singapore, they said at first, we're making this mandatory, but don't worry, we're going to collect data that we would never use for like a criminal policing aspect. We're only using it for public health. And of course, they did use it for the criminal policing aspect. So like, not a surprise, like saw that one coming a mile away. And absolutely, I think the UK would have done it. I mean, we've seen, unfortunately, we're going through our COVID inquiry now, and it's been pretty grim, the behavior of people in power, certainly within our current government. A lot of the ministers who were not following their own laws, or the police were really clamping down, and there was like certain people were more heavily policed than others, and there was a racial, ethnic, class component to that, right? So you do that, and then you put technology solutions on top of that. I just think you're going to create some really serious problems. The Parliament hadn't really created pandemic legislation in place to deal with it. And part of the reason I put my book out in February of 2022, and that was because I was, my poor publishers, I was like, we have to wait, because they started passing legislation. I think it was, I have to remember now, the last order. England was the last one to create a legal framework to allow these apps, which had already been in existence for like a year at that point, maybe even more. They didn't have a legal framework for it, though, in the four nations of the United Kingdom until starting in September of 2021. And then England was the last one in December of 2021. So I was typing against the clock because I wanted to capture that before we went to press and put it out, to show really that the UK had completely changed its position. We used to be a country that was super proud of not having identity cards, and all of a sudden in this case we did, and we've also put them in for voting now, by the way, which is like massive cultural shift here, not without protest. So they did that. And then within like 2 months of England passing that law, they basically were like, we're not using the app anymore. Why? Because it wasn't effective. It was not what was needed. So we did all of this mass, they blew a huge amount of political capital and wasted loads of time on something that they, in the end, themselves decided wasn't going to be a requirement. And what was really awful in that is they kept lying about it. So they kept saying, A, we're not building it, when they were secretly building it. Then they were like, well, we're building it, but it's not going to be mandatory, and blah, blah, blah. So each time they kind of destroyed public trust, which is essential in something like a national crisis or international crisis like a pandemic. So, my takeaway, for what it's worth and stuff like that, is, A, I'm not convinced it was worth it scientifically, medically. It wasn't what healthcare professionals certainly were calling for. The risks are super high in terms of potential for abuse, and they blew so much political and social trust. And that matters in a democracy, because if we, I guarantee you, if we go again into another pandemic, a lot of people are going to remember all the lying that governments did. Trust matters when you're handing over data. Trust matters if you're doing surveillance, and trust matters in terms of health, and because you're talking to people about their bodies ultimately. You play with that with your peril. So that for me was the real learning point, was like, how do I create trust in the scientific method, in healthcare? You're asking people to make massive sacrifices. You have to be even more trustworthy than normal, because you're making a bigger ask, a bigger demand. And for my 2 cents, for what it's worth, in the UK, we blew that. We absolutely blew it. So it wouldn't be great to have run that experiment again if there's pandemic version 2.0. I would have a lot of confidence, and I suspect the US would be the same. I mean, that was another case. My family and friends over in America, they were like, there was no case of requiring people to use that kind of surveillance technology for health, for better or for worse. And you can look at the outcomes on that, but that's what I'm talking about. the technology is just one part of it. There's the cultural bit about adaptation.
Yeah.
Why were certain European countries happy to do it and others weren't? Certain countries could afford to do it or had the infrastructure to do it. Certain populations have an iPhone or an Android and others just don't. So it's not even an option for them, right? Like all of those things come into play. And if you're looking at utilitarianism, if you're looking at like the greatest number of happiness for the greatest numbers of people, you might want to do what I was trying to do, which is go back to the original problem set and go, what is it that the healthcare profession says it needs? It needs PPE. They thought they needed ventilators. That later was sort of dismissed because, to be honest, by the point you're on a ventilator, it's pretty bad. They needed people to stay home, and they really needed a race for a vaccine. That is where you want to put, given that you have limited capital and limited resources, that's where you want to go. But people were super excited with this idea that an app on our phone is going to allow us to open up society again.
No, I have to tell you, here in Portugal, the government also put out an app in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And back then they were moralizing people a lot. Oh, you should install the app, blah, 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 blah. It's a health measure, whatever. And I was like, so first of all, I never installed the app because it was not mandatory. So I myself never installed the app at all. But first of all, I was like, yeah, and if certain people do not even have smartphones to begin with. I mean, are you also going to moralize those people? I mean, no one should be forced to have a smartphone. If they have one of those older cell phones, I mean, who cares? And then I was like, I was taking the pandemic very seriously. I was masking all the time. I was staying at home as much as possible. I was distancing as much as possible. I got tested 2 or 3 times during the pandemic. It always came out negative, fortunately. And I was like doing everything apart from the app. And I was like, okay, if I'm doing all of this, let's say that I cross paths with someone who also has the app installed and I get an alert on my phone saying that I went by was less than 3 meters or whatever away from a person who got diagnosed with COVID. Yeah, what am I going to do with that? Right. Because let's get real. Even if I get COVID, but I'm asymptomatic, I'm not going to get tested. Let's get real. So, I mean, how valuable is that information for me? And if I am COVID negative, no one out there who goes by me will get any alert saying that they crossed paths with someone who has COVID. So, I mean, and I got vaccinated as soon as possible. So, what can I gain, or anyone who crosses paths with me can gain from this? And I never installed the app.
You did it though, because like the sort of wannabe scientist in me is like, I'm glad that we tried it, because like I understand in those pre-vaccine days, like people were like, we have to try whatever we can. Yeah, that's understandable. I'm glad we tried it in a number of different countries with the different political and cultural flavors, so that we could see like what works or what might not work, because we don't know, again, wherever the next pandemic will come from, we don't know when that will happen and where we'll be with our technology. That's kind of why I was really motivated to write the chapters. Like, I want to capture the UK case study to the best of my ability now, not just the tech part, but the social, cultural part. Because if this happens again, you know, when it happened for us in 2020, I was going back to books on the Spanish flu in 1918. I was like, I need to skill up fast. What do I need to know about this? And I'm sure loads of people felt the same way, just as ordinary citizens. You don't have to be a researcher to be interested in, you know, learning what had happened in previous pandemics. But I wanted to create something so that future researchers could go back and be like, well, what happened in the UK? And, you know, I'm sure loads of people have written stuff on that. For what it's worth, I will share this. The Ada Lovelace Institute here in the United Kingdom is a wonderful research institution, and they've just come out with their assessment of pandemic technology. I haven't had a chance to read it yet because I just came back from holiday, but it looks pretty interesting and they do great work. So that might be something for your viewers slash listeners to check out if they want to. I feel like the Turing Institute might have been as well. And definitely Oxford University has published a lot of stuff on it, but I'm intrigued by the Ada Lovelace view because they often do an international comparison. So there is cutting edge research that I am unfortunately behind on at the moment, but we know it's there. So if anyone wants to take a look at that, if you don't want to hear what I have to say, by all means don't. Go check out Ada Lovelace because they've got some good stuff.
And I mean, just to be clear, I'm not completely dismissing these apps. I'm not saying 100% that they didn't help at all, that they weren't good health measures. I'm just saying that, first of all, no one should be forced to have a smartphone. That's the first point.
Yeah, a government issue.
Second of all, you shouldn't moralize people for not having a smartphone or installing.
You really shouldn't moralize them when you're the British ministers who were breaking all of their own rules.
Yeah,
it's one thing to moralize if you at least walk the walk, but if you're doing hypocrisy, like get out.
And then my third note. And then the third point, and that's why I mentioned that I really followed all the guidelines and all of that to prevent COVID transmission, is that you have to convince me that it's worth it, because I'm not dumb and people are not dumb. Don't treat us as dumb, like, oh, you should do this. Yeah, why? Yeah. Why?
Well, exactly.
You have to tell me why.
As with anything, if you're asking people to make a change, you have to show them why it is worth it. Listen, I'm just aware of the fact that it's approaching 11. I'm going to have to let you go if that's okay, because I unfortunately have to talk to one of my clients.
Oh, yeah. No, sorry. I
no, is that okay? I love this chat, but I was like, oh no, the time has flown.
No, I'm sorry. I wasn't aware that you had
not at all.
Time limit. So, yeah, so just quickly before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, I mean, I'm a Google search away. Probably the easiest is my website, which is Harebrain, Hare, brain.co. So you can find all my television and radio and online writing and paper writing there. My book is available at all good bookstores. You can just order it through your local independent bookstore or pay evil Amazon. It's up to you, your call, not mine, how you want to do it. So it's there. It's an audiobook too, if you prefer to listen to it rather than read it, but then you'll miss the amazing data viz, which is in the book. So it just depends on what you want. And I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn in case anybody has questions or wants to follow up or share something that they think I've missed or that I need to look at. I'm really, really lucky. For some reason, I have an incredible group of people from the public who just send me stuff randomly, tips of things to look at or articles that are actually really interesting or examples from their country that I would never have heard about otherwise. So I love to hear from people. If somebody wants to get in touch, I would be very welcome, as long as it's polite, kind, no romance stuff, please. But the marriage proposals get a bit weird at the end. But no, I would love to talk technology and ethics with any of your listeners or viewers. And I'm so grateful to you for the chance to have this chat.
No, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for your time. And hopefully somewhere in the future we can have another conversation. I really loved this one. So
I would love that too. I will drop you a note if I am ever in Portugal again, which I hope I will be.
Okay, great.
All right, be well and let me know when it comes out. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, sure.
Love that. The marriage proposals get a bit weird at the end, but no, I would love to talk technology and ethics with any of your listeners or viewers. And I'm so grateful to you for the chance to have this chat.
No, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for your time. And hopefully somewhere in the future we can have another conversation. I really loved this one. So
I would love that too. I will drop you a note if I am ever in Portugal again, which I hope I will be.
Okay, great.
All right, be well and let me know when it comes out. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, sure. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please do not forget to like it, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like more generally what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You have all of the links in the description of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Per Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Francis Ford, Tiago Dunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Weira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hallman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eikeland, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Olsen, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Holt Ericbun, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Gressis, Tom Roth, the RPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Manuel Oliveira, Kimberly Johnson, and Benjamin Galbart. A special thanks to my producers, Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.